appeals were denied. She spent today with her family, had fried chicken for dinner before entering the death chamber.
I wish that I could take every bit of hurt on myself.
Virginia, you are the murderer tonight.
Hate is a lack of education, and you're not born to hate.
It's just hard to describe.
Almost 6 years. The first week I was here was the worst week that I have spent.
Number 6, Philip Workman. Philip Workman was put down in Tennessee. Unlike most people, he got his last meal wish after he perished. Workman had turned down the usual final meal of his choice traditionally offered to the condemned, asking instead that a vegetarian pizza be given to a homeless person. Prison officials refused to send out a pizza, and Workman passed by lethal injection.
His family, Mrs. Oliver, to this day I still remember her, how I wanted to die at that moment, just watching her and, on the witness stand, and just because of what I created up to a certain point.
But news accounts of his request touched a nerve with the public.
It's just hard to describe. The perjured testimony, how many perjured testimonies does it take?
In honor of his request, Nashville's Union Rescue Mission received 170 pizzas. Media reports said listeners to a radio station in Minnesota also ordered pizzas sent to another organization for troubled youngsters. Number 5, Victor Fegues. Victor Feguer was a convicted slayer who was sentenced to his demise by lethal injection in Iowa. He was punished on March 15, 1963, but his last meal stirred more interest than people expected. Feguer had a troubled childhood and was often in trouble with the law. He dropped out of high school and later joined the U.S. Army. However, his military career was short-lived as he was discharged after just a few months due to mental health issues. After leaving the Army, Feguer drifted from job to job and eventually became involved in a life of crime. In 1960, he and 2 accomplices committed a robbery in which the victim was slain. Feguer was caught, and despite his protests of innocence, he was convicted of slaying and sentenced to his demise. On the day of his punishment, Feguer requested a single olive with the pit still in it as his last meal. This seemingly odd request has led to speculation about its significance. Some have suggested that Feguer was sending a message about the biblical story of Gethsemane, in which Jesus prayed and sweated drops of blood before his arrest and crucifixion. In the story, Gethsemane is an olive grove, and the pits in Feguer's olives could be seen as symbolic of the pits in the cherries that are often used to represent drops of blood in artistic depictions of the scene. Regardless of the significance of Feguer's last meal, his punishment was carried out as scheduled. He was pronounced deceased at 12:03 a.m. on March 15, 1963. Number 4, James Edward Smith. James Edward Smith was an interesting individual, and his last meal request is definitely the strangest one on this list. With a seemingly normal childhood, James attended but didn't finish college. In his late 20s, he worked as a tarot card salesman and taxi driver. He also claimed to be a voodoo priest. On March 7, 1983, James attempted to rob the Union Life Insurance Company in the International Trade Center in Houston, Texas. He put on a mask and walked up to Deborah Wilson at the cashier window. Seeing the gun in James's hand, she hid behind a filing cabinet. Larry Rojas, the district manager, put some money in a trash can and placed it on a table near James. He started to walk toward Deborah, but James stopped him. James shot Larry once, and Larry began to run away. James shot him again in the chest, slaying him. Another employee of the insurance office chased James to an apartment complex. Several other men joined the chase along the way. They tackled James in the parking lot and held him there until police arrived. During the jury selection for his trial, James escaped from the courthouse but was caught soon after. James was sentenced to his demise by lethal injection and waived his final appeals. Despite this, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that James may not have been mentally fit to stand trial, and his case was reviewed. His mother told the court that he practiced black magic, voodoo, and witchcraft. He confessed to 6 other slayings, calling them ritualistic, including the decapitation of a 1-year-old. These claims were never substantiated. His punishment by lethal injection took place on June 26, 1990. His last words were Hare Krishna. For his last meal, James asked for Rayakunda dirt. He told prison officials that he intended to use it for a voodoo ritual. Dirt was not on the prison's list of approved food. He was instead provided a cup of yogurt. Number 3, Teresa Lewis. Teresa Lewis was the first woman to be put down in the U.S. for 5 years and in Virginia since 1912.
And with those words, the first woman in almost 100 years has been put to death in Virginia.
The execution of Teresa Lewis has been carried out in the manner as prescribed by the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Murder for hire case. 41-year-old Teresa Lewis was given lethal injection for her part in a 2002.
Death was pronounced at 9:13 p.m. There were no complications.
Lewis, who had learning difficulties, used bodywork and cash to persuade hitmen to slay her family in 2002.
Prosecutor says she used sex and cash to pay the two men. Lewis hired two men to kill her husband and stepson. She was hoping to cash in on her son's life insurance policy. Her husband and stepson were shot and killed inside their Pennsylvania home.
On 30 October 2002, Lewis left the door to her family home in the Virginia city of Danville unlocked for gunmen Matthew Schellenberger and Rodney Fuller.
Protesters gathered outside the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett.
It's a terrible, appalling thing to execute Teresa Lewis.
Many felt Lewis should have been given the same punishment as her co-defendants. The men both got life sentences.
Virginia, you are the murderer tonight.
Lewis's husband Julian, 51, and stepson Charles, 25, were later found deceased from shotgun blasts.
That the governor would step in and stop the execution, but in the end, that call never came. Alveda Lewis spent most of the day with her family, hoping all day long.
She was sentenced fatally for her role in the slaying. Lewis spent her last hours with her spiritual advisor and family members at the prison in the city of Jarrett. She requested a final meal of 2 breasts of fried chicken, sweet peas with butter, a slice of either German cake or apple pie, and a Dr. Pepper soft drink, prison spokesman Larry Traylor said.
On a website aimed at saving her life, Lewis sang about needing a miracle. That miracle never came before entering the death chamber. All her appeals were denied. She spent today with her family, had fried chicken for dinner, before her body was driven away from the prison.
She looked quite scared. She looked a little nervous.
She spent her last hours with a minister.
As she was escorted into the chamber, Lewis appeared tearful, her jaw clenched. Shortly before her punishment, Lewis asked if her stepdaughter Kathy Clifton, daughter of her slain husband Julian Lewis, was there. Miss Clifton was in a witness room separated from the punishment chamber by a two-way mirror. "I want Kathy to know that I love her and I'm very sorry," Lewis said.
She said, "I just want Kathy to know I love her and I'm very sorry."
She had this to say before she died.
Ms. Lewis did make a last statement.
Clifton is the daughter of Lewis's late husband. Kathy Clifton was in there tonight to witness, and the Kathy that she's referring to is Kathy Clifton, Lewis's stepdaughter, the execution.
Those were her final words. Number 2, Lawrence Russell Brower. This was the meal that pissed off Texas officials enough to actually ban the last meal tradition for any inmate on the row. Brower asked for the most over-the-top last meal you can imagine. He ordered 2 chicken fried steaks with gravy and sliced onions, a triple patty bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet with ground beef, tomatoes, onions, bell peppers, and jalapenos, a bowl of fried okra with ketchup, 1 pound of barbecued meat with half a loaf of white bread, 3 fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, 1 pint of Bluebell ice cream, a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts, and finally, 3 root beers. The cherry on top of this meal was the fact that he refused to eat any of it, simply saying he wasn't hungry.
King, along with Sean Berry and Russell Brewer, stopped to give Bird a ride. They chained Bird to the back of their truck and dragged him 3 miles down a deserted road. King and Brewer were ex-cons, avowed racist, and dumped what was left of his body in front of a black church. That's where Sheriff Rowles found him the next day.
On June 7, 1998, for nearly 3 miles down Huff Creek Road outside Jasper, Brewer and Sean Berry killed Bird by dragging him behind Berry's pickup truck. Of a gay man in Wyoming 3 months later led to the first federal hate crimes legislation. The capital murder convictions combined with a conviction in the killing.
After the incident, Texas prison officials announced that they would do away with the long-standing tradition of giving end-row inmates the chance to choose their last meal. Instead, they'll simply have to eat whatever comes out of the kitchen.
And overnight, Jasper became a touchstone around the world for race hatred and violence. Evidence at the scene, including a KKK lighter, quickly led the sheriff to the 3 killers. The killing brought in outsiders and opened racial fissures in the community.
Hate is a lack of education. You're not born to hate.
It forced a dialogue about race relations that Bird's sister says still needs to continue.
Number 1, Velma Barfield. Velma Barfield was an American serial slayer who was convicted of slaying several people, including her own mother. In 1978, Barfield was hired as a caretaker by a wealthy family in North Carolina. Over several years, she poisoned several members of the family, including her employer, with arsenic-laced food and drinks. She also slayed her mother by poisoning her with insecticide. Barfield was arrested in 1978 and later confessed to the slayings. She was found guilty and sentenced to her demise.
I'm sorry for the hurt that I've caused.
Now drug-free, a repentant Barfield says she regrets the pain she has caused others.
Today, if it were possible, so many people, I wish that I could take every bit of hurt on myself.
On the row at Raleigh-Velma, now off the drugs, she expressed remorse for the years that the pills had blurred her judgment and destroyed her moral compass. However, she could not really explain why she had done what she did.
Almost 6 years. The first week I was here was the worst week that I have spent. Total, isolation from everybody that I had been with. Drug nightmare. Days of not knowing where you are or what you've done. The last 10 years was just like that. Years of...
She became a born-again Christian whilst awaiting trial, and during the next 6 years that she spent on the row, did a lot to help and counsel other female inmates.
Her attorney would not allow her to say whether she knew what she was doing when she committed her crimes. It's her relationship with God, she says, that has enabled her to survive her confinement. But once confined in prison, Barfield says, she found God.
I know that without him, living in prison every day is a struggle, even at its best. His strength that has sustained me, I couldn't have made it even thus far.
Under North Carolina law, she was allowed the choice of her punishment by lethal gas or lethal injection, and not surprisingly, she chose the latter. She could not face her last meal and asked a guard to get her Coca-Cola and cheese doodles instead. She dressed in her own pink pajamas for the punishment and was made to wear a diaper. A stethoscope and heart monitor were taped to her chest. The wheeled gurney was taken to her cell, and she was secured to it with straps over her body and legs. Catheters were inserted into her arms, and a saline drip started before she was wheeled into the chamber a few minutes before 2 a.m. 3 syringes were attached to each of the IV lines, and these were operated by 3 volunteers. One of the IV lines was in fact a dummy, so none of the 3 volunteers could be sure if he had actually finished her or not. She was pronounced deceased at 2:15 a.m. The punishment had gone without any hitches. That's all for today, folks. See you next time.